The Oklahoma dust swirled around Marianne Fletcher's worn boots as she stood at the altar of the small country church, her hands trembling inside her grandmother's lace gloves. The man beside her wasn't someone she'd chosen, wasn't someone she loved, wasn't even someone she'd spoken more than 10 words to before this moment. At 19 years old, with her father's debts hanging over their family like a death sentence, Marianne had become a bargaining chip, a solution to a problem. Her daughter traded away to save the rest. James Crawford stood beside her in his only suit, patches visible on the elbows, his calloused hands clasped in front of him. He was 32, a poor farmer with more land than money, more integrity than prospects. When he'd agreed to pay off her father's gambling debts in exchange for a wife, everyone had assumed they knew what kind of man he was, what kind of arrangement this would be. What happened when they reached his farmhouse that evening would shatter every assumption, challenge every expectation, and prove that sometimes the most shocking thing a man can do is treat a woman like a human being. But before we get to that moment that changed everything, you need to understand how Marianne Fletcher ended up standing at that altar in the first place, and why the whole town of Millbrook, Oklahoma, thought they knew exactly how this story would end. They were all wrong. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Marianne had always known her father was weak, but she hadn't realized how dangerous weakness could be, until the morning Robert Fletcher came home with Thomas, Garrett's signature on a piece of paper that might as well have been her death warrant. It was April 1935, and the Dust Bowl had already stolen 3 years of decent harvests from Oklahoma. The Fletcher family farm, 30 acres of increasingly barren land outside Millbrook, was barely producing enough to feed the family, let alone generate income. Marianne's mother, Dorothy, took in sewing and laundry from the few families in town who could still afford to pay. Her younger brother, Samuel, only 14, worked odd jobs after school, and Marianne herself had been teaching at the small schoolhouse in town for a year, her modest salary keeping them just above starvation. But Robert Fletcher had never been content with just above starvation. He wanted the prosperity he remembered from before the crash, before the drought, before everything turned to dust and desperation. And so he'd started making trips to Thomas Garrett's establishment on the edge of town, a place that was half general store, half saloon, and entirely a trap for men who confused hope with strategy. Garrett ran poker games in the back room, games where credit was easy and interest was crushing. Robert had convinced himself he could win back everything they'd lost, could restore his family's fortunes with the right hand of cards. Instead, he dug them into a hole so deep that daylight looked like a distant memory. $1,200, her mother whispered that morning, her face ashen as she clutched the paper Robert had brought home. "Robert, we don't have $1,200. We don't have $100. Marianne stood in the doorway of their small kitchen, still wearing her nightgown, her long auburn hair loose around her shoulders. She'd heard her parents arguing through the thin walls of their farmhouse, and had come to investigate. Now she wished she'd stayed in bed, stayed ignorant for just a few more hours. "I know that, Dorothy," her father snapped. But there was no real anger in his voice, only defeat. "Garrett knows that too. That's why he's given me an alternative." The way he said alternative made Marianne's stomach drop. She stepped fully into the kitchen, and both her parents turned to look at her. Her mother's eyes were red from crying. Her father couldn't quite meet her gaze. "What alternative?" Marianne asked, though some instinct told her she already knew the answer. Robert Fletcher cleared his throat. "James Crawford has offered to pay the debt in full, in exchange for marriage to you." The words hung in the air like smoke from a fire that was already consuming everything she'd planned for her future. Marianne gripped the back of a chair to steady herself. "James Crawford?" she repeated. "The farmer with that property near Broken Creek?" "He's a good man," her father said quickly, defensively. "Owns his land outright, no mortgage. Works hard. He's offered to take you as his wife and pay off the entire debt to Garrett. He's 32 years old. Marianne's voice came out hollow. I've never even had a conversation with him. And you're telling me you've already agreed to this? Her mother made a small sound of distress. Marianne, sweetheart, we didn't know what else to do. If we don't pay Garrett, he'll take the farm. He'll take everything. Samuel won't have a home. We'll be on the streets. So instead, you're selling me? Marianne felt something cold and hard settling in her chest, replacing the warmth she'd always associated with family, with home. We're not selling you, her father protested, but his voice lacked conviction. This is a marriage arrangement. Plenty of marriages start this way. You'll be a farmer's wife instead of a schoolteacher. You'll have security, a home of your own. I have security. I have a job. I've been supporting this family for a year, while you threw our money away on cards and whiskey. The anger that burst from Marianne surprised even her. She'd always been the dutiful daughter, the responsible one, who never complained about sacrificing her own dreams to help her family survive. Robert's face flushed. You watch your tone, girl. I'm still your father. A father who just traded his daughter to pay his gambling debts. Marianne's hands were shaking. Did Crawford suggest this, or did Garrett? Because I'm guessing Garrett saw an opportunity to get his money and get rid of an inconvenient debt at the same time. Her mother stood, reaching for Marianne's hand. It was Crawford's idea. He approached Garrett about it 3 days ago. Garrett told your father, and it seemed like the only solution. Why would James Crawford want to marry me? Marianne pulled her hand away. He's never shown any interest in me. We've barely spoken. He needs a wife, her father said. He's been alone on that farm for years. And you're beautiful, Marianne. You're young and healthy and educated. Any man would be fortunate to have you. The compliments felt obscene, coming from the man who was bartering her away like livestock. Marianne turned toward the window, staring out at the dusty yard, the struggling vegetable garden her mother tended, the barn that was slowly collapsing because they couldn't afford repairs. When is this supposed to happen? She asked quietly. Saturday, her father replied. 4 days from now. Crawford wants to get the planting done, and he says having a wife will help with the work. 4 days. Marianne had 4 days before her entire life changed, before she became the property of a stranger, before she lost her job, her independence, herself. And if I refuse? She turned back to face her parents. What happens if I say no? Her mother's face crumpled. Then Garrett takes the farm. We lose everything. Samuel loses his chance at finishing school. We'll have to leave Millbrook, try to find work somewhere else, probably end up in one of those government camps. The guilt was immediate and crushing. Marianne loved her brother fiercely. Samuel was bright, talented, deserving of a future that didn't involve migrant labor and desperate poverty. And her mother, already worn thin by years of hardship, would never survive losing her home. What do you know about James Crawford? Marianne asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Beyond the fact that he has money to pay father's debts? Her parents exchanged glances. Her mother spoke first. He inherited his farm from his uncle about 8 years ago. Keeps to himself mostly. Comes into town for supplies, but doesn't socialize much. Never married, though there was talk about a girl years ago who died of influenza. He's quiet, her father added. Not friendly exactly, but not mean either. Works his land alone, doesn't hire help even during harvest season. People say he's stubborn, independent. People say he's strange, Marianne corrected. I've heard the women at church talking. They say he's odd, that there must be something wrong with a man who stays so isolated. People talk because they're bored and miserable, her mother said sharply. That doesn't make their gossip true. From everything I've seen, James Crawford is simply a private man who prefers his own company. Marianne absorbed this information, trying to build a picture of the man who would become her husband in 4 days. A private man, isolated, quiet, those could mean anything. They could mean he was gentle and shy, or they could mean he was dangerous and volatile. There was no way to know. Has he? Marianne struggled with the question. Has he said what he expects? From the marriage? Her father looked uncomfortable. Her mother's expression was pained. He expects a wife, Robert said gruffly. Someone to keep house, help with the farm work, provide companionship. The usual things, the usual things. Marianne understood what that meant, what every married woman understood it meant. She would belong to James Crawford in every sense of the word. Her body, her labor, her future, all of it, would become his property the moment she spoke her vows. She was 19 years old. She'd never been kissed, never been courted, never even held hands with a boy beyond friendly gestures. She'd been too busy working, too focused on helping her family survive to think about romance or marriage. And now she was expected to give herself completely to a stranger because her father couldn't control his gambling addiction. "I need time to think," Marianne said finally. "There isn't time," her father replied. "Crawford needs an answer by tomorrow morning. If you refuse, he'll withdraw the offer and we'll have to face Garrett." Marianne looked at her mother, saw the desperation there, the fear of losing everything. She thought about Samuel, about his dreams of becoming a teacher, of having a life beyond the dust and poverty that had consumed their family. She thought about her own dreams, her hope of eventually saving enough to go to college, to become a real teacher instead of just filling in at the local schoolhouse. All of those dreams evaporated in the face of her family's need. "I'll do it," she heard herself say, the words coming from somewhere distant, as if someone else was speaking through her mouth. "I'll marry James Crawford." Her mother burst into tears, relief and guilt mixing on her face. Her father nodded curtly, unable to meet her eyes, and Marianne felt something inside her shut down, a protective numbness spreading through her chest. She had 4 days to prepare for a wedding she didn't want, to a man she didn't know, for a future she couldn't imagine. 4 days to say goodbye to the girl she'd been and become whatever James Crawford expected her to be. The next morning, Marianne walked to the schoolhouse for what would be one of her last days teaching. She'd already informed the school board that she would be leaving after her marriage, watching their expressions shift from surprise to knowing sympathy as they realized what kind of arrangement this was. Mrs. Henderson, the elderly woman who managed the school board, had pulled Marianne aside after the meeting. "You're a good teacher, dear. The children will miss you. Are you certain about this marriage?" "Certainty is a luxury I can't afford," Marianne had replied, and Mrs. Henderson had nodded sadly, understanding exactly what that meant. Now, standing in front of her classroom of 15 students ranging from 6 to 14 years old, Marianne tried to focus on the lesson, on teaching them arithmetic and reading, on pretending that her world wasn't ending in 3 days. During lunch, while her students ate their meager meals outside, there was a knock on the schoolhouse door. Marianne looked up from the papers she was grading to find James Crawford standing in the doorway, hat in his hands, looking distinctly uncomfortable in the small space designed for children. "Mr. Crawford." Marianne stood quickly, her heart suddenly pounding. This was the first time she'd seen him up close since the arrangement had been made. "I wasn't expecting you." "I apologize for interrupting your work, Miss Fletcher." His voice was deeper than she'd expected, quiet but clear. "I wanted to speak with you before Saturday. Seemed like we should talk." Given the circumstances, Marianne gestured to one of the adult-sized chairs at the back of the room, and they both sat, suddenly formal with each other, despite the intimacy that their impending marriage implied. Up close, James Crawford was not an unattractive man. His face was weathered from years of outdoor work, with lines around his eyes that suggested he squinted against the sun frequently. His dark brown hair needed cutting, and his hands, resting on his knees, were scarred and calloused from farm labor. He had the solid build of someone who did physical work every day, broad shoulders and strong arms visible even through his work shirt. But it was his eyes that surprised her. They were grey, unexpectedly gentle, and when they met hers, she saw something she hadn't anticipated: uncertainty. James Crawford was nervous. "I imagine this isn't how you pictured getting married," he said finally, his voice matter-of-fact rather than apologetic. "I hadn't pictured getting married at all," Marianne replied honestly, "at least not for several more years. I had plans to continue teaching, maybe to save enough for college eventually. James nodded slowly. Your father mentioned you were a teacher. The children here seem fond of you. I watched them outside, laughing. That's your doing, I expect. They're good children. They deserve better than what this drought and depression have given them. Marianne folded her hands in her lap, trying to appear composed. Mr. Crawford, I think we should be direct with each other. You're paying a substantial amount of money to marry me. I need to understand what you expect in return. He seemed to consider this carefully before responding. I expect honesty. I expect effort. I expect you to treat the farm and the house as your own, because they will be. Beyond that, he paused, choosing his words. Beyond that, I expect we'll figure things out as we go. That's not much of an answer, Marianne said, allowing a hint of challenge into her voice. If she was going to be trapped in this marriage, she at least wanted to understand the rules. No, I suppose it's not, James agreed. But I'm not sure I can give you a better one. I've never been married before. I don't know exactly what to expect any more than you do. You're paying $1,200 for me, Marianne stated flatly. Surely you have some idea of what you think that money is buying. James's expression hardened slightly. I'm not buying you, Miss Fletcher. I'm paying off your father's debt. There's a difference, is there? Marianne challenged. Because from where I'm sitting, the result looks the same. I become your wife, your property, whether I want to or not. He was quiet for a long moment, studying her face. Do you really believe that? That I see you as property? I don't know what you see me as, Mr. Crawford. That's the problem. I'm supposed to marry you in 3 days, and I don't know anything about you except that you're willing to pay a significant sum for a wife you've never had a conversation with. That doesn't exactly inspire confidence about how you view women. To her surprise, James smiled slightly, though there was no humor in it. Fair enough. You want honesty? Here it is. I'm 32 years old. I've spent the last 8 years building that farm alone, working from dawn until dark, eating alone, sleeping alone, living alone. It's a hard life, Miss Fletcher, and it's a lonely one. When I heard about your father's situation, about his debt to Garrett, I saw an opportunity. Not to buy a woman, but to maybe convince one to take a chance on a life that wouldn't be easy, but wouldn't be cruel either. He leaned forward slightly, his expression serious. I know what people in town say about me. That I'm strange, antisocial, probably dangerous in some way, because I don't socialize. The truth is simpler and less interesting. I'm just tired. Tired of being alone. Tired of having no one to talk to. Tired of living like a monk when I'm not a monk, just a man who wants someone to share his life with. Marianne felt something shift in her chest. A tiny crack in the wall of resentment she'd been building. Why didn't you just court someone normally? Millbrook has plenty of unmarried women who would have considered a proposal from a landowner. Because I'm not good at courting, James said simply. I'm not charming or smooth-talking. I can't dance. I don't know how to make pretty speeches or buy nice presents. But I can work hard. I can provide. And I can promise you'll be treated with respect. Respect, Marianne repeated. What does that mean to you? James met her eyes directly. It means I won't force you. It means I'll listen when you speak. It means your opinions will matter in decisions about our life together. It means I understand you're entering this marriage against your will, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise or punish you for it. The words hung between them, heavy with implication. Marianne felt tears threatening and blinked them back angrily. She would not cry in front of this man, would not show weakness. I don't love you, she said bluntly. I don't even know you. And I resent being put in this position where I have to choose between my family's survival and my own future. I know, James replied quietly. And I don't love you either. I'd be lying if I claimed otherwise. But maybe we can build something honest instead. Maybe respect and partnership are better foundations than romance anyway. Marianne wanted to argue, to insist that love mattered, that romance was important. But she'd seen enough loveless marriages in Millbrook to know that James might be right. Her own parents had married for love, and look where that had led, to debt and desperation, and trading their daughter to save themselves. I need to get back to my students, she said finally, standing. Was there anything else you wanted to discuss? James stood as well, taller than she'd realized, towering over her 5'4" frame. "Just one thing. On Saturday, after the ceremony, we'll go to the farm. You'll have your own room, your own space. I won't assume anything. We'll take things slowly. Figure out what kind of marriage this is going to be together, not according to what other people expect." It was more than Marianne had dared to hope for, this promise of autonomy, of time. She nodded, not trusting her voice. James put his hat back on and turned toward the door. Then he paused, looking back at her. "For what it's worth, Miss Fletcher, I'm sorry this is how we're meeting. You deserve better than a marriage made out of desperation. I'll do my best to make sure you don't regret it any more than you already do." Then he was gone, leaving Marianne standing alone in her classroom, wondering if she'd just had a conversation with her future husband, or made a deal with a stranger who was very good at saying the right things. Saturday arrived too quickly, bringing with it a clear sky and temperatures that promised another scorching summer. Marianne, dressed in her mother's wedding dress, altered to fit her smaller frame, the white fabric yellowed with age, but still beautiful. Her mother braided her auburn hair and pinned it up, her hands trembling as she worked. "You'll be all right," Dorothy whispered, though it sounded more like a prayer than a promise. "James Crawford is a good man. He'll take care of you." Marianne didn't respond. She felt numb, disconnected from her own body as her mother fastened the buttons down her back. As her brother Samuel appeared in the doorway looking guilty and miserable. As her father called that it was time to leave for the church. The ceremony was small, attended by only a handful of people, her immediate family. Thomas Garrett, who had a financial interest in seeing this marriage completed, and a few curious townsfolk who'd heard about the arrangement. James stood at the altar in his patched suit, his expression neutral, revealing nothing. Reverend Morrison performed the ceremony quickly, perhaps sensing that no one wanted to draw this out. When it came time for James to place the ring on her finger, Marianne noticed his hands were shaking slightly. Somehow that small sign of nerves made him seem more human, less like the stranger who was taking ownership of her life. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," Reverend Morrison intoned. "You may kiss the bride." James hesitated, then leaned down and pressed a brief, chaste kiss to Marianne's cheek rather than her lips. It was over in a second, but she caught the scent of soap and sun-dried cotton, realized this was the closest she'd ever been to him. And then it was done. She was Mrs. James Crawford, bound by law and God to a man she didn't know, beginning a life she hadn't chosen. What happened next? As James helped her into his wagon and they headed toward his farm, would either confirm her worst fears or prove that sometimes, just sometimes, desperate circumstances could lead to unexpected grace. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The wagon rattled along the dusty road, leading out of Millbrook, each turn of the wheels carrying Marianne further from everything familiar and closer to a future she couldn't predict. James sat beside her on the wooden bench, the reins held loosely in his capable hands, his attention fixed on the road ahead. Neither of them had spoken since leaving the church 15 minutes ago. Marianne clutched her small traveling bag on her lap, everything she owned in the world compressed into one worn leather case. Her mother had packed it the night before, 2 additional dresses, undergarments, her grandmother's Bible, a photograph of her family taken 3 years ago when times were better, and the small silver locket her father had given her for her 16th birthday, back when he still had money to spare for such things. The landscape around them was familiar, yet felt foreign, now that she was seeing it as a married woman being taken to her new home. The Oklahoma plains stretched endlessly in every direction, the grass brown and brittle from years of drought. Occasional farmhouses dotted the horizon, most of them showing signs of the same neglect and poverty that had consumed the Fletcher property. Dust devils danced in the distance, small tornadoes of dirt that had become as common as clouds in the years since the drought began. The farm is about 8 miles from town, James finally broke the silence, his voice carefully neutral. "Takes about an hour by wagon. It's isolated, but that also means privacy. No neighbors close enough to gossip about our business." Marianne nodded but didn't respond. She was still processing the fact that she'd just married this man. That the gold band on her finger, simple, unadorned, clearly purchased with practicality rather than sentiment in mind, marked her as his wife, Mrs. James Crawford. The name felt strange, like a costume she was being forced to wear. "There's a creek that runs through the property," James continued, apparently deciding that filling the silence was preferable to letting it stretch between them. "That's why my uncle chose the land originally. Even in drought years, the creek keeps flowing. Means we have water for the house and for irrigation. It's kept the farm productive when other places have failed completely. That's fortunate." Marianne managed, forcing herself to engage, even though she wanted to retreat into silence, into the numbness that had protected her through the ceremony. "The house isn't fancy," James warned, glancing at her briefly before returning his attention to the road. "It's solid, weatherproof, but it's a working farmhouse, not a showplace. 2 bedrooms, a main room that serves as kitchen and living space, a cellar for storage. There's a barn for the animals and equipment, a chicken coop, a smokehouse. Everything a farm needs to be self-sufficient. Self-sufficient." The word carried weight. James Crawford had built a life that didn't depend on anyone else, that operated independently of the town and its social structures. Marianne wondered if that independence extended to how he viewed marriage, or if he expected her to simply fold herself into his established routines without complaint. They passed another abandoned farmhouse, the windows broken, the door hanging off its hinges. A family had lived there once, the Hendersons, Marianne remembered. They'd left 2 years ago, unable to make the land produce enough to survive. She taught their daughter Emily, a bright girl with a talent for mathematics, who'd cried when they'd packed up their wagon and headed west toward California, chasing rumors of work and rain. "Do you know what happened to your father's debt?" James asked suddenly. "I mean, beyond the fact that I paid it." The question surprised her. "I assume Mr. Garrett recorded it as satisfied and destroyed the promissory notes. Why?" "Because I made sure to get every piece of paper with your father's signature on it," James said, his tone matter-of-fact. "All the notes, all the receipts, everything. I burned them myself last night. Garrett doesn't have anything he could use to come after your family again." Marianne turned to look at him properly for the first time since they'd left the church. "Why would you do that?" James shrugged, but there was something deliberate in the gesture. "Because your father's weakness shouldn't haunt your family forever. And because I didn't want Garrett to have any leverage to use against you or your mother or your brother. What's done is done. No sense leaving loose ends that could cause trouble later." It was a kindness she hadn't expected, a thoughtfulness that contradicted the image she'd been building in her mind of a man who saw her as a purchased commodity. Marianne felt that crack in her resentment widen slightly. "Thank you," she said quietly. "That was considerate." "It was practical," James corrected, though his tone wasn't dismissive. "I don't do things out of pure kindness, Mrs. Crawford. I do things that make sense. And leaving your family vulnerable to Garrett didn't make sense, Mrs. Crawford." Hearing him say it made the reality of her situation crash over her again. She was married to this man for the rest of her life, unless death or some other catastrophe intervened. "You can still call me Marianne," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "If we're going to be married, formal address seems unnecessary." James was quiet for a moment. "Marianne, then. And you can call me James. No need for the Mr. Crawford business." They lapsed back into silence, but it felt slightly less oppressive now. The wagon continued its steady progress along the rutted road, passing occasional landmarks that Marianne recognized, the old oak tree that had somehow survived the drought, its branches bare, but its trunk still standing, the stone marker indicating the boundary between Millbrook Township and the unincorporated territory beyond, the abandoned schoolhouse where classes had been held before the population dwindled and consolidation forced the remaining students into town. "I need to tell you something," Marianne said abruptly, surprising herself with the words. About my expectations, or lack of them. James glanced at her, his expression attentive but unreadable. All right. I don't know how to be a farmer's wife, she continued, the words tumbling out now that she'd started. I can cook basic meals and do laundry and mending, but I've never managed a household independently. I've never raised chickens or tended a garden on the scale that a farm requires. I've never preserved food for winter or made soap or any of the 100 other things I assume a farm wife needs to know how to do. That's fine, James said simply. I wasn't expecting you to know everything already. But you're paying $1,200 for a wife who's essentially useless at the work you need done, Marianne challenged. That seems like a poor investment. James actually smiled at that, a brief flash of expression that transformed his face from stern to almost handsome. You're not useless. You're educated. You can read and write and do mathematics. You understand how to teach, which means you understand how to learn. The practical skills will come with time and instruction. You sound very certain of that. I am certain of it, James replied. You survived teaching 15 children in a one-room schoolhouse during a depression and drought. You supported your family for a year on a teacher's salary that probably barely covered expenses. That takes intelligence and determination. The rest is just learning new applications for those same qualities. Marianne hadn't expected this kind of analysis, this pragmatic assessment of her capabilities that somehow felt more complimentary than any flowery praise could have been. James Crawford saw her clearly, not as a romantic ideal or a decorative acquisition, but as a person with specific strengths that could be applied to new challenges. I won't pretend to be happy about this marriage, she said, deciding that if he valued honesty, she should provide it. I resent being put in this position. I resent my father for gambling away our security. I resent Mr. Garrett for enabling him. And yes, part of me resents you for being the solution to a problem I didn't create. That's fair, James acknowledged. I'd resent me too in your position. But Marianne continued, if I have to be married, I'd rather be married to someone who treats me like a thinking person instead of a decorative object. So, thank you for that at least. You're welcome, James said. Then after a pause, for what it's worth, I know this isn't the life you would have chosen. But I'll do my best to make it bearable. Maybe even good eventually, if we're both willing to work at it. The farm appeared on the horizon about 20 minutes later, and Marianne felt her stomach tighten with anxiety. This was it, the place that would be her home now, the land she would work, the house where she would sleep and wake and live out however many years fate granted her. The property was more substantial than she'd expected. The farmhouse itself was a solid 2-story structure, painted white, though the paint was fading and peeling in places. A wide porch wrapped around the front, offering shade and a place to sit during hot evenings. Behind the house stood a large red barn, also showing its age but structurally sound. And beyond that, she could see the chicken coop James had mentioned, a small storage shed and what looked like a vegetable garden, though it was hard to tell, given the state of the drought-stressed plants. The creek James had mentioned ran along the eastern boundary of the visible property, a ribbon of water that caught the afternoon sunlight. Trees, actual living trees with green leaves, clustered along the creek bank, their roots apparently reaching deep enough to access water even when the surface soil was dust. It's bigger than I expected, Marianne admitted as James guided the wagon toward the house. 160 acres total, James said. Only about 40 are under active cultivation right now. The rest is grazing land for the cattle and natural prairie. My uncle bought it cheap 30 years ago when this area was still being settled. He built the house and barn himself, lived here alone until he died, and left it to me. James brought the wagon to a stop near the front porch and set the brake. For a moment, neither of them moved. This was the threshold, the moment when they would enter the house together as husband and wife. When the theoretical would become practical. Before we go in, James said, turning to face her directly, I want to make something clear. What I told you at the schoolhouse still stands. You'll have your own room, your own space. I'm not expecting intimacy. until and unless you decide you're ready for it. And if you're never ready for it, then we'll figure out what kind of marriage we can have without it." Marianne stared at him. "You're saying you'll honor a celibate marriage, if that's what I want?" "I'm saying I'll honor whatever terms make this bearable for you," James corrected. "I married you because I was tired of being alone, not because I was looking for a bedmate I could buy." "There's a difference. Most men wouldn't see it that way," Marianne said carefully. "Most men would consider it their right to expect certain things from their wives. Most men are fools who confuse power with partnership," James replied flatly. "I've spent 8 years alone, Marianne. I can continue to manage my physical needs on my own, if necessary. What I can't manufacture is companionship, conversation, someone to share the work and the burdens, and maybe eventually the satisfactions of building something lasting. That's what I'm hoping for from this marriage. The rest can wait until you trust me enough to want it, or not. Either way, the choice is yours." Marianne felt tears burning behind her eyes again. She'd spent 3 days preparing herself for the worst, for a wedding night that would be frightening and painful, for a husband who would view her body as his property purchased fairly and legally. The reality of James Crawford's promise was so far from her fears that she didn't quite know how to process it. "Why?" she whispered. "Why would you make such a promise?" James climbed down from the wagon and came around to her side, offering his hand to help her down. When she took it, his grip was warm and steady. "Because I remember what it feels like to be powerless," he said quietly. "And I won't do that to someone else, especially not to the woman who's supposed to be my partner in life." He released her hand as soon as she was safely on the ground, respecting the physical distance between them, even as he'd just offered her an emotional safety she hadn't dared to hope for. "Come on," James said, picking up her traveling bag. "Let me show you your new home. Then we can talk about how we're going to make this work." Marianne followed him up the porch steps, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and something else, something that might have been the faintest glimmer of hope. Maybe this wouldn't be the prison sentence she'd feared. Maybe James Crawford really was different from the men she'd known. Different from her father and Mr. Garrett and all the others who saw women as lesser beings to be controlled and used. The front door opened with a slight creak, revealing a spacious interior that was clean but sparse. The main room was exactly as James had described, kitchen and living space combined. With a wood stove in one corner, a sturdy table with 4 chairs, a pair of worn armchairs near a fireplace, and shelves lined with books and supplies. Windows on 3 sides let in abundant light, and the floors, though scarred from years of use, were swept clean. "Your room is upstairs," James said, setting her bag down and gesturing toward a staircase along the far wall. "It's the larger of the 2 bedrooms. Has better ventilation for summer and a window that looks out toward the creek. I've been using the smaller room for years, so there's no need to switch." Marianne climbed the stairs slowly, aware of James following behind her. The upstairs hallway was short, with 2 doors facing each other. James opened the one on the right. The bedroom was simple but surprisingly spacious. A double bed with a plain quilt occupied one wall. A dresser stood opposite, its surface empty and waiting. A washstand with a pitcher and basin sat beneath the window James had mentioned, which indeed offered a view of the creek and the trees beyond. The room was clean, the floor recently swept, the surfaces dust-free. "I cleaned it yesterday," James said, sounding almost embarrassed. "Figured you'd want to start fresh. The dresser is empty for your things. There's space in the closet for your dresses. And the bed linens are new, well, new to you. I bought them in town last week." Marianne set her bag on the bed, running her hand over the quilt. It was well made, if worn, the pattern a simple log cabin design in blues and browns. "Did your aunt make this?" "My mother, actually," James said. "She made it for my uncle when he first built this house. Said every home needed something made with love in it, even a bachelor's house. Uncle kept it all these years, and when he died and left me the place, I kept it too. Seemed wrong to get rid of it. There was something about the story, about James preserving his mother's work, about him thinking to clean the room and prepare it for her arrival, that made Marianne's throat tight. She'd been so focused on her own resentment and fear that she hadn't fully considered what this might mean for James, bringing a stranger into the home he'd occupied alone for 8 years, disrupting his routines, sharing his space. "Thank you," she said, turning to face him, "for preparing this, for trying to make it welcoming." James nodded, then stepped back toward the hallway. "I'll let you settle in. Take your time unpacking, rest if you need to. I have evening chores to do, feeding the animals, checking the irrigation, things that can't wait. When you're ready, come down and I'll show you around the property properly. Then we can have supper and talk about how we want to handle the household work going forward." He started to leave, then paused in the doorway. "Marianne, I meant what I said, about taking things slowly, about letting you choose. I know you don't have much reason to trust me yet, but I hope eventually you'll see that I keep my promises." Then he was gone, his footsteps receding down the stairs, the front door opening and closing, leaving Marianne alone in her new room, in her new home, with her new life stretching out before her like uncharted territory. She moved to the window and looked out at the creek, at the miracle of green trees in a landscape of brown. The sun was beginning its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Somewhere in the distance, she could hear cattle lowing and the sound of chickens settling in for the night. Marianne unpacked her bag slowly, placing her few belongings in the empty dresser drawers, hanging her 2 dresses in the closet where they looked lost and lonely. She set her grandmother's Bible on the small table beside the bed, positioned the family photograph where she could see it first thing in the morning, and fastened her mother's locket around her neck, the weight of it familiar and comforting. When she was finished, she sat on the edge of the bed and finally allowed herself to cry. Not the desperate, frightened tears she'd been holding back for days, but something more complex. Grief for the life she'd lost, relief that her worst fears hadn't materialized, confusion about what came next, and underneath it all, that stubborn flicker of hope that maybe, just maybe, she could build something worthwhile from this impossible situation. Outside, she could see James working near the barn, his movements efficient and practiced as he carried hay and checked fences and performed the endless tasks that kept a farm running. He didn't look toward the house, giving her privacy even though he must know she could see him. Marianne dried her tears, straightened her dress, and went downstairs. If this was going to be her life, she might as well start learning how to live it. And James Crawford, for all his strangeness and isolation, seemed willing to teach her. That had to count for something. Marianne descended the stairs with cautious steps, her hand trailing along the wooden banister that had been worn smooth by years of use. The main room looked different now in the slanted light of early evening, shadows pooling in the corners while golden sunlight streamed through the western windows. She could see dust motes dancing in the beams, could smell the faint scent of wood smoke from the stove, and something else. Bread, she realized. Fresh bread. A covered basket sat on the table that hadn't been there before, and when Marianne lifted the cloth, she found 2 loaves of bread still warm, along with a crock of butter and a jar of what looked like preserves. A note in neat, feminine handwriting lay on top. "Welcome to the neighborhood. If you need anything, we're 3 miles south. Clara Henderson." The kindness of it surprised her. She'd assumed that the isolation James had mentioned meant complete solitude. But apparently there were neighbors after all, people who knew about the hasty wedding and had chosen to offer hospitality instead of judgment. The front door opened, and James entered carrying a bucket of milk, the white liquid still frothy from recent collection. He paused when he saw her standing by the table. "You found Mrs. Henderson's gift," he said, setting the bucket on the counter near the stove. "She rode over this afternoon while I was getting ready for the ceremony. Said she remembered what it was like being a new bride far from family and wanted to make sure you had something decent to eat tonight." "That was kind of her," Marianne said, carefully replacing the cloth over the bread. "I didn't realize you had neighbors close enough for visiting. The Hendersons are the only ones within reasonable distance." James explained, retrieving a clean pitcher from a cabinet and beginning the process of straining the milk through cheesecloth. Frank Henderson farms about 3 miles south. Good man, keeps to himself mostly but helpful when needed. His wife, Clara, is more social. She's the one who usually initiates contact. They have 2 children, both grown and moved to Kansas City. Marianne watched him work, noting the practiced efficiency of his movements. Everything about James spoke of self-sufficiency, of a man who'd learned to manage every aspect of his life without depending on anyone else. I should learn how to do that, she said, gesturing to the milk straining. Along with everything else I don't know. James glanced up, his grey eyes meeting hers. There's no rush. We'll start with the basics tomorrow. Tonight, let's just focus on getting through our first evening without either of us feeling more awkward than necessary. The acknowledgement of the awkwardness actually helped ease some of it. Marianne found herself almost smiling. That seems like a reasonable goal. I thought we could have a simple supper, James continued, finishing with the milk and covering the pitcher before placing it in what Marianne now noticed was an icebox, a luxury many families couldn't afford. There's cold chicken from yesterday, some potatoes I can fry up, and Mrs. Henderson's bread. Nothing fancy, but it'll fill the stomach. Can I help? Marianne asked, uncertain of the protocol. Was she supposed to immediately take over all cooking duties? Or was it acceptable to ease into the domestic responsibilities gradually? You can set the table if you'd like, James suggested. Plates are in that cabinet, silverware in the drawer below. There's a pitcher of water in the icebox, if you want to pour glasses for both of us. They worked in companionable silence, James at the stove preparing the simple meal, while Marianne set 2 places at the wooden table. The domesticity of it felt surreal. This morning, she'd been Marianne Fletcher, school teacher and reluctant daughter. Now she was Marianne Crawford, farm wife and virtual stranger to the man whose name she bore. When the food was ready, they sat across from each other at the table. James bowed his head briefly, a quick private grace that Marianne barely had time to register before he was reaching for the chicken. She followed his lead, serving herself small portions while her stomach churned with anxiety that had nothing to do with hunger. "Tell me about the teaching," James said after a few bites, apparently determined to fill the silence with conversation. "What made you want to become a teacher?" The question surprised her, not because it was inappropriate, but because it suggested genuine interest in her life before today. Most men she knew wouldn't have bothered asking about a woman's previous ambitions once she'd become a wife. "My mother was a teacher before she married," Marianne explained, carefully spreading butter on a slice of Mrs. Henderson's excellent bread. "She taught me to read before I started school, and I always loved it. The way books could transport you somewhere else, teach you things about the world beyond Oklahoma. When the position opened at the Millbrook Schoolhouse 2 years ago, it seemed like the perfect opportunity. Did you enjoy it?" "Most days," Marianne admitted. "The children were challenging but rewarding. Some of them were so hungry for knowledge, so eager to learn despite everything happening around them. The drought, their families struggling, the constant uncertainty. Teaching them felt like I was doing something meaningful, something that might give them better futures than their parents had." James nodded thoughtfully. "That's how I feel about farming, oddly enough. Even with the drought, even with the depression, there's something meaningful about coaxing life from the soil, about producing food that keeps people alive. It's hard work and often frustrating work, but it matters. I never thought about farming that way," Marianne said slowly. "I always saw it as, I don't know, something people did because they had no other choice. Especially now, with conditions so bad, some people farm that way," James agreed. "They see it as a burden, something to endure until they can escape to a city job. But for me, it's always been more than that. It's about understanding the land, working with it instead of against it, building something sustainable that can last generations." He paused, seeming to consider his next words carefully. "That's part of why I wanted a wife, actually. Not just for the practical help, though that's certainly important, but because farming alone feels incomplete. It's meant to be a family enterprise, multiple generations working together, building on what came before, creating something that outlasts any individual person. That's assuming the land survives, Marianne pointed out. The drought has been going on for years. What if it never rains properly again? What if the Dust Bowl just keeps getting worse until there's nothing left to farm? Then we adapt, James said simply. We find crops that need less water. We implement better irrigation from the creek. We focus on cattle instead of crops if necessary. Giving up isn't an option when you have nowhere else to go. Marianne studied him across the table, this man who spoke about adversity with such matter-of-fact determination. You really believe that? That we can just adapt our way through a catastrophe? I believe the alternative is despair, and despair is useless, James replied. I'd rather spend my energy trying to solve problems than lamenting their existence. They continued eating in more comfortable silence, the food simple but satisfying. Marianne found herself appreciating Mrs. Henderson's bread more with each bite. It was expertly made, the texture perfect, the taste slightly sweet. Her own bread-making skills were adequate at best. Another item on the long list of things she needed to improve. After supper, James cleared the dishes over Marianne's protests that she should be doing it. Tomorrow we'll establish routines, he said, pumping water into a basin for washing. Tonight we're both adjusting. No need to add household duty negotiations to the mix. Marianne watched him wash the dishes with the same efficiency he'd shown milking the cow and cooking the meal. Where did you learn to manage a household so thoroughly? Most men I know can barely boil water. James smiled slightly, his hands submerged in soapy water. 8 years living alone will teach you quickly. At first, I ate a lot of burnt food and wore a lot of dirty clothes. But eventually, you either learn or live in squalor, and I'm not constitutionally capable of tolerating squalor. Your uncle didn't teach you? Uncle Martin died 3 months after I arrived to help him run this place, James explained, his voice neutral, despite discussing what must have been a difficult time. Heart gave out one morning while he was checking fences. I found him that afternoon, buried him on the hill overlooking the creek where he'd wanted to be laid to rest, and then had to figure out how to keep the farm running by myself. That must have been terrifying, Marianne said softly. Being suddenly alone and responsible for everything. It was clarifying, James corrected. I learned what I was capable of when there was no one else to rely on. Turns out I'm capable of quite a bit when necessity demands it. He dried the dishes and put them away in their designated places, every movement suggesting long-established habit. Then he turned to face her, leaning against the counter with his arms crossed. I should show you where everything is, he said. The barn, the animals, the water pump, the root cellar. That way, if something happens to me, if I get injured or sick, you'll know how to keep things running. That seems morbid to discuss on our wedding day. Marianne observed. It's practical, James countered. On a farm, you have to plan for contingencies. Animals need feeding, whether humans are healthy or not. Crops need tending. Water needs hauling. If you don't know where things are and how systems work, a single accident could mean disaster. He had a point, though Marianne found his pragmatism slightly unsettling. Then again, wasn't this exactly what she'd said she wanted? A husband who treated her as a capable partner, rather than a decorative dependent. All right, she agreed. Show me! They left the house together, stepping into the warm evening air. The sun had dropped below the horizon, but enough twilight remained for easy visibility. James led her first to the barn, a structure much larger up close than it had appeared from the wagon. Inside, the barn smelled of hay and animals and leather. 3 cows occupied stalls on one side, their large eyes regarding the visitors with placid curiosity. 2 horses, the gelding James had driven to town, and a mare Marianne hadn't seen before, stood in stalls on the opposite side. Farm equipment lined the walls, plows, harnesses, tools whose purposes Marianne couldn't immediately identify. The cows need milking twice daily, James explained, gesturing to the animals. Morning and evening, roughly 12 hours apart. I'll handle it for the first week or so while you learn. The chickens need feeding every morning and their eggs collected daily. The horses need feeding morning and evening as well, and their stalls mucked out every few days. Marianne tried to memorize everything, feeling overwhelmed by the sheer number of tasks that apparently needed daily attention. "How do you manage all this alone?" "Routine," James said simply. "You develop a system and stick to it. Once you know what needs doing and when, it becomes almost automatic. Your body wakes up knowing it's time to milk the cows. Your hands reach for tools without conscious thought. It's like teaching, I imagine. After a while, you don't have to think about classroom management because it's become second nature." The comparison helped Marianne contextualize what he was describing. She had developed those kinds of automatic routines in her classroom, had learned to manage multiple students at different learning levels simultaneously without conscious planning. Perhaps farm work would eventually feel similarly intuitive. They left the barn and walked to the chicken coop, where about 20 hens were settling on their roosts for the night. James pointed out where the feed was stored, how to collect eggs without disturbing the hens too much, how to check for predators that might threaten the flock. "Foxes are the main problem," he explained. "They'll kill more than they can eat if they get into the coop. I've reinforced the structure pretty thoroughly, but vigilance is important. If you notice any signs of digging near the foundation or any hens acting particularly nervous, let me know immediately." Next was the vegetable garden, though calling it that felt generous given its current state. A few struggling tomato plants clung to life, their leaves yellowed and sparse. Some onions pushed up through the dusty soil, and what might have been squash plants sprawled in one corner, looking more dead than alive. "The drought makes gardening difficult," James admitted, and for the first time Marianne heard something like discouragement in his voice. "I've tried irrigation from the creek, but it's labor-intensive, and the results have been disappointing. This year, I'm considering focusing more on root vegetables that can handle dry conditions better." "My mother had a garden," Marianne offered. "Nothing this size, but she managed to keep some herbs and vegetables alive, even during bad years. She might have suggestions if you'd be willing to listen." James looked at her with interest. "I'm willing to listen to anyone with practical knowledge. Pride doesn't produce tomatoes. If your mother knows techniques I haven't tried, I'd welcome the information." They continued the tour, the smokehouse where meat was preserved, the root cellar built into a hillside where vegetables and preserved goods were stored in cool darkness, the water pump that drew from a deep well supplementing the creek water, the small workshop where James apparently did repairs and built necessary items. By the time they'd circled back to the house, full darkness had fallen. Stars emerged in the vast Oklahoma sky, more visible here away from town than Marianne had ever seen them. The Milky Way sprawled overhead like someone had spilled milk across black velvet. "It's beautiful," she said softly, tilting her head back to take in the celestial display. "That's one advantage to isolation," James agreed, standing beside her on the porch. "No light from town to obscure the stars. On clear nights, it's like you can see straight into infinity." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, two strangers bound by law and circumstance, looking up at the same stars that had witnessed countless other arranged marriages throughout human history. Marianne wondered how many of those marriages had started with such careful negotiation, such explicit discussion of terms and expectations. Probably very few. Most women simply accepted whatever their husbands demanded. "Having no other option, I should tell you," James said quietly, still looking at the stars rather than at her, "that I appreciate how difficult this must be for you. Walking into a stranger's home, being expected to build a life with someone you have no reason to trust or even like. If I could have found another way to solve my loneliness that didn't require disrupting your life, I would have taken it, but you couldn't," Marianne said, not accusingly but simply stating fact. "No, I couldn't, and your father's debt created an opportunity that I took, knowing full well that I was benefiting from your misfortune. That makes me complicit in the injustice of this situation, and I'm sorry for that." Marianne considered his words carefully. "You're not responsible for my father's gambling or Mr. Garrett's exploitation. And you've been more considerate than you had any obligation to be. That doesn't make this situation fair or right, but it makes it bearable. That's more than I expected. James finally looked at her, his face partially illuminated by lamplight from inside the house. I want it to be more than bearable eventually. I want to build a genuine partnership where we both benefit from this arrangement, where you don't spend every day resenting being here. That's an ambitious goal, Marianne said with a slight smile. But not an impossible one, I suppose, if we're both willing to work toward it. Are you? James asked. Willing to work toward it? Marianne thought about her options, the non-existent alternatives that had brought her to this moment. She thought about her brother Samuel still in school, her mother no longer facing destitution, her father's debts erased. She thought about James's promise of autonomy, his respect for her boundaries, his matter-of-fact treatment of her as a capable person rather than a subordinate possession. Yes, she said finally, I'm willing to try. I can't promise I'll stop resenting the circumstances that brought me here, but I can promise I'll give this marriage a genuine effort. That seems fair. James extended his hand, and after a moment's hesitation, Marianne shook it. The gesture was oddly formal for a married couple, but somehow appropriate for their situation. Two people entering a business partnership that happened to also be a marriage, sealing their agreement with a handshake rather than a kiss. Then let's consider this our real vow, James said. To try, to be honest with each other, to build something worthwhile from an imperfect beginning. To try, Marianne echoed. They went inside together, and James showed her how to bank the fire in the stove for the night, where the extra blankets were stored in case the temperature dropped, how to lock the doors and windows. Then he walked her to the bottom of the stairs. Sleep well, he said. Tomorrow we'll start teaching you the farm routines. It'll be a long day, so rest while you can. Good night. James, Marianne replied, climbing the stairs with a strange mixture of exhaustion and restless energy. In her room, she changed into her nightgown and climbed into the bed that was now hers. In the house that was now hers, living the life that was now hers, whether she'd chosen it or not. Through the window she could still see the stars, constant and indifferent to human struggles. Downstairs she heard James moving around, preparing for his own rest. The sounds were oddly comforting, evidence that she wasn't completely alone, even if she was isolated. Marianne closed her eyes and tried to sleep, tried not to think about everything that had changed in a single day, tried not to worry about all the challenges that awaited her tomorrow and all the tomorrows after that. She'd married a stranger to save her family. Now she had to figure out how to live with that stranger, how to become partners with someone she didn't know, how to build a life from the fragments of her broken plans. It seemed impossible, but then again, so had surviving her first day of teaching, and she'd managed that. Perhaps she could manage this too. Marianne woke to the sound of a rooster crowing, its insistent call dragging her from dreams she couldn't quite remember. For a disoriented moment, she didn't recognize her surroundings. The unfamiliar room, the slant of morning light through a window positioned differently than the one in her childhood bedroom. Then reality crashed back with the weight of the gold band on her finger. She was married. This was her new home. Today would be her first full day as Mrs. James Crawford. The house was quiet. But when Marianne descended the stairs, after dressing quickly in her simplest work dress, she found evidence that James had already been up for hours. The stove was warm. Coffee sat in a pot waiting for her. And through the window she could see him in the barn, already engaged in morning chores. She poured herself coffee, black, since she didn't know where James kept sugar and was too proud to search, and stood at the window watching him work. Even from this distance, his movements were efficient and purposeful. He carried a bucket to one of the cow stalls, positioned a three-legged stool, and began the rhythmic process of milking. His shoulders moved in steady repetition, and Marianne realized she was watching someone who had performed this exact task hundreds, probably thousands of times. The coffee was strong and bitter, shocking her system awake. Marianne forced herself to drink it, despite her usual preference for tea, understanding that she needed to adapt to what was available rather than expecting accommodations for her preferences. When James finally returned to the house carrying 2 buckets of fresh milk, he found her setting out plates and the remains of Mrs. Henderson's bread for breakfast. "You're up early," he observed, setting the buckets on the counter. "I thought you might sleep later after yesterday's stress." "I'm used to early mornings from teaching," Marianne replied, trying to sound more confident than she felt. "Children arrive at 7:30, which means I needed to be at the schoolhouse by 7 to prepare." "Sleeping past dawn feels wasteful," James nodded approvingly. "That's good. Farm life doesn't accommodate late risers, especially during growing season. Though I should mention, you don't need to worry about preparing breakfast for me. I'm used to grabbing whatever's quick and getting to work. No need to add formal meals to your adjustment burden. I have to eat regardless," Marianne pointed out. Setting an extra plate isn't a burden. They sat together at the table, and Marianne noticed that James ate quickly, efficiently, as if meals were simply fuel rather than experiences to be savored. She found herself eating faster to match his pace, not wanting to delay whatever work needed doing. "I thought we'd start your education with the chickens," James said between bites. "They're the most forgiving of the animals. Hard to truly damage them through inexperience. The cows require more finesse with milking, and the horses can be dangerous if you don't understand their moods. But chickens? Chickens are straightforward." After breakfast, James led her to the chicken coop, where the hens were already active and vocal. Inside the small wooden structure, they crowded around James's feet expectantly, clearly accustomed to his presence meaning food. "They need about a 1/4 pound of feed per bird per day," James explained, showing her the covered barrel where he stored the grain mixture. "You scatter it in the yard rather than putting it in feeders. Lets them forage naturally, keeps them healthier. Like this," he demonstrated, tossing handfuls of grain in wide arcs that had the chickens scrambling and pecking enthusiastically. When he handed Marianne the scoop, she mimicked his motion, though her throw was less practiced and the grain distribution more uneven. "That's fine," James assured her. "They'll find every kernel regardless of where it lands. The important thing is making sure you count roughly 20 scoops so each bird gets enough." Next came egg collection, which proved more challenging than Marianne anticipated. The hens didn't appreciate having their nests invaded, and several pecked at her hands when she reached beneath them for eggs. James showed her how to approach from the side, how to use confident but gentle movements that didn't trigger defensive behavior. "They're prey animals," he explained. "They're always nervous because everything wants to eat them. Foxes, hawks, coyotes, even snakes. You have to move in ways that don't make them think you're a predator." By the time they'd collected 14 eggs, fewer than Marianne expected from 20 hens, her hands were scratched and she'd developed a healthy respect for the small, seemingly harmless birds. "Why so few eggs?" she asked as they carried the basket back toward the house. "Stress from the heat," James said. "Chickens lay less in extreme temperatures, and we've been over 90 degrees for 2 weeks straight. Also, a few of the hens are molting, which temporarily stops egg production. In spring and fall, when conditions are better, we'll get 18 to 20 eggs daily." They stored the eggs in the cool root cellar, and then James walked her through the process of checking the water supply for all the animals, ensuring troughs were full, that the water was clean, that the systems he'd rigged for automatic filling from the creek were functioning properly. "Water is everything on a farm," James emphasized as they stood by the creek, watching it flow with surprising vigor despite the drought. "This creek is why this property survives when others fail. Uncle Martin chose this land specifically because he'd learned from his own father that you can overcome almost any agricultural challenge if you have reliable water." Marianne knelt by the creek bank, trailing her fingers through the cool current. "Where does it come from? Why doesn't it dry up like other water sources?" "It's fed by an underground spring in the hills to the northwest," James explained. "The spring itself is fed by an aquifer deep enough that surface drought doesn't affect it significantly. As long as that aquifer exists, this creek flows. It's the single most valuable feature of this property. He showed her the irrigation channels he'd dug to divert creek water to different parts of the cultivated land. The simple gate system that controlled flow. The way he'd positioned plantings to maximize the benefit of available water while minimizing waste. Farming in a drought isn't about fighting the conditions, James said, as they walked along one of the irrigation channels. It's about accepting them and adapting. I've stopped trying to grow water-intensive crops like corn. Instead, I focus on wheat, which tolerates dry conditions better, and on cattle, which can graze the natural prairie grass that's evolved to survive here. They spent the next hour walking the property boundaries, James pointing out landmarks and explaining how the farm was organized. The cultivated fields occupied the flattest terrain near the creek. The grazing land spread across rolling hills where native grass still grew despite the drought. A small orchard of struggling fruit trees occupied a protected hollow, apple and peach trees that James's uncle had planted decades ago, now barely surviving, but too established to abandon. These trees haven't produced decent fruit in 3 years, James admitted, examining the sparse leaves on an apple tree. But they represent years of growth, and Uncle Martin loved them. I keep hoping one good rain season will revive them, allow them to produce again. Marianne heard the emotion beneath his practical words. This man, who claimed to be purely pragmatic, was keeping trees alive partly from sentiment, from connection to the uncle who'd left him this land and this life. Tell me about him, she said impulsively. Your uncle. What was he like? James was quiet for a moment, his hand resting on the trunk of the apple tree. He was tough. Had to be, to survive alone out here for 30 years. But he was also gentle with things that depended on him. Animals, plants, even tools. He'd talk to the cows while milking them, thank the horses after hard work days. My father used to mock him for it, said Martin was soft in the head from too much solitude. But you didn't think that, Marianne observed. No, I thought he understood something important, that life, any kind of life, deserves respect and decent treatment. That just because you have power over something doesn't mean you should abuse that power. James looked at her directly. That philosophy extends to people too, to marriages, to how men should treat their wives. The implication was clear, and Marianne felt a mixture of gratitude and caution. James was drawing a line between himself and men like her father, men who used their power carelessly. But words were easy. Actions over time would prove whether his philosophy was genuine or just another form of manipulation. They continued the tour, James showing her where he stored equipment, how he maintained tools, the workshop where he did repairs and carpentry. He explained his system for crop rotation, his breeding plans for the cattle, his hopes for expanding the farm if conditions improved. I want to build a proper dairy operation eventually, he said as they stood, overlooking the grazing land where his small herd of cattle dotted the landscape. Right now I have 3 milk cows and about 20 head of beef cattle. But with good management and adequate water, this land could support 50 head or more. That would generate enough income to hire help, to expand the house, to build a real future. That's ambitious, Marianne said. Most farmers right now are just trying to survive, not expand. Survival is important, James acknowledged. But if you only focus on survival, you never build anything better. I'd rather work toward improvement and risk failure than settle for mere subsistence. By midday, Marianne was exhausted, her feet aching from hours of walking, her mind overwhelmed with information. They returned to the house for a simple lunch of bread, cheese, and cold water from the spring house, a small structure James had built over the coldest section of the creek where he stored perishables. How are you holding up? James asked as they sat in the shade of the porch, escaping the brutal midday heat. Overwhelmed, Marianne admitted. There's so much to learn, so many systems to understand. I keep wondering how you manage all of this alone. Years of practice, James said. And lower standards than you might expect. I don't keep the house as clean as it should be. I eat simple, repetitive meals because I don't have time or skill for elaborate cooking. The garden struggles partly because I can't give it the attention it needs while managing everything else." He leaned back against the porch post, his expression thoughtful. "That's part of why I wanted a partner. Not just for the labor, though that's valuable, but for the specialization. If you can eventually manage the household, the garden, the chickens, maybe the dairy work, then I can focus on the fields, the cattle, the heavy construction and repair work. We'd both be working hard, but we'd be working smarter, each focusing on what we're best suited for." "That assumes I'll become competent at those tasks," Marianne pointed out. "Right now I'm barely capable of collecting eggs without getting pecked to death," James smiled. "Right now. But 3 months from now? 6 months? You're intelligent and motivated. You'll learn." They spent the afternoon with more practical instruction. James taught her how to identify the different cattle by sight, how to check for signs of illness in livestock, how to read weather signs that might indicate coming rain or continued drought. He showed her his record-keeping system, a series of ledgers where he tracked everything from seed purchases to milk production to breeding. Schedules. Farming is as much about information as physical labor, he explained, flipping through pages of his neat handwriting. If you don't track what works and what fails, you're just repeating the same mistakes endlessly. These records let me make informed decisions based on evidence rather than hope. Marianne studied the ledgers with genuine interest. This was something she understood: documentation, analysis, learning from data. In her teaching, she'd kept similar records of which students struggled with which subjects, which teaching methods produced better results, which materials were most effective. "I could help with this," she offered. "Record-keeping is something I'm actually good at." "That would be incredibly helpful," James said, and she heard genuine relief in his voice. "I've tried to stay on top of it, but often I'm too tired at the end of the day to record everything properly. Having someone who could maintain these records consistently would make planning much more effective." They were finding common ground, Marianne realized, discovering ways their different skills and experiences could complement each other rather than clash. It wasn't romance or even friendship yet, but it was the beginning of functional partnership. As evening approached and James went to do the second round of animal feeding and milking, Marianne attempted her first solo cooking effort in the farmhouse kitchen. She found a ham in the spring house, potatoes in the root cellar, and set about creating something more substantial than their simple lunch. The kitchen was better equipped than she'd expected. Good knives, adequate pots and pans, even a few spices she recognized. James might claim to eat simple meals, but he'd apparently invested in the tools to make better cooking possible if someone with skill was available. Marianne peeled potatoes while watching through the window as James worked in the barn. His shirt was off now, draped over a fence post, and she could see the sun-darkened skin of his back, the muscles that came from years of physical labor. There was something honest about his body. It was built for purpose rather than appearance. Every line of it shaped by function. She looked away quickly, feeling heat in her face that had nothing to do with the stove. James was her husband in name, and eventually he might be her husband in fact if she decided she could trust him that completely. But she wasn't ready to think about that yet, wasn't ready to acknowledge the physical reality of marriage to a man she barely knew. By the time James returned to the house for supper, Marianne had created a respectable meal: fried ham, mashed potatoes with butter, green beans she'd found preserved in the root cellar. It wasn't elaborate, but it was more substantial than the simple fare they'd eaten earlier. James paused in the doorway, taking in the scene. "This smells incredible." "It's just basic food," Marianne deflected, though she felt pleased by his reaction. "It's the first real meal I've had in this house since Uncle Martin died," James said quietly. "I'd forgotten what it was like to come in from work and find supper waiting. Thank you." They ate together as twilight gathered outside, falling into easier conversation than the previous evening. James asked about her teaching experiences. And Marianne found herself sharing stories about her students, the children who'd struggled and eventually succeeded, the ones who'd had to leave school to help their families, the small victories and large frustrations of trying to educate in the midst of an economic catastrophe. "You miss it," James observed. "Teaching." "Yes," Marianne admitted. "I miss feeling like I was doing something important, something that mattered beyond just survival. I miss the children. Some of them were so bright, so capable, and they deserved better circumstances than what they were born into." "You could still teach," James said thoughtfully. "Not at the schoolhouse, obviously, but there are children in this area who don't have access to education. The Hendersons' neighbors to the east have 3 young ones. There's a family about 6 miles north with 5 children. If you wanted to organize informal lessons, maybe a few hours a week, I don't think anyone would object." The suggestion surprised and touched her. "You wouldn't mind?" "That would take time away from farm work." "It would take a few hours a week away from farm work," James corrected, "and it would give you something fulfilling beyond just learning to feed chickens. That seems like a worthwhile trade. Besides, educated neighbors benefit everyone eventually. Children who can read and calculate become adults who can run farms and businesses more effectively." Marianne felt something loosen in her chest, a tension she hadn't fully acknowledged until it eased. The idea that she might not have to completely abandon her identity as a teacher, that she could maintain some connection to work she found meaningful, made this new life seem less like a prison and more like a different kind of opportunity. "I'd like that," she said softly. "Thank you for suggesting it." After supper, they sat on the porch again, watching the sun set beyond the western fields. The sky painted itself in shades of orange and purple, and for a moment the harsh landscape looked almost beautiful. "First full day complete," James said. "How do you feel?" "Exhausted," Marianne replied honestly. "Overwhelmed, but also maybe slightly hopeful? I'm not sure yet." "Hopeful is good," James said. "I'll take hopeful over resentful any day." They sat in companionable silence as stars began emerging overhead. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called, its voice lonely and wild. James seemed completely at ease with the isolation, while Marianne still felt the strangeness of being so far from other people, from the constant activity and noise of town life. "Does it ever bother you?" she asked. "Being so alone out here?" James considered the question carefully. It did at first. Those first months after Uncle Martin died, the silence was oppressive. I'd go days without speaking to another human being. But eventually I adjusted, found ways to make peace with solitude. And now, he glanced at her, now I'm not alone anymore. The simple statement carried unexpected weight. Marianne was here now, permanently, inescapably part of his daily life. They would see each other every morning and evening, share meals and work, and the endless challenges of farm life. She wouldn't just be living on the property, she'd be living in constant proximity to him. "I should warn you," Marianne said. "I'm not always easy to live with. I have opinions about everything. I argue when I disagree. I'm stubborn about things I think are important." "Good," James replied. "I'd rather have a partner who challenges me than one who just agrees with everything I say." Echo chambers are useless for making good decisions. They stayed on the porch until full darkness fell, then went inside to prepare for bed. At the base of the stairs, James paused. "You did well today. I know it was a lot to absorb, but you approached everything seriously. That matters. I'm trying," Marianne said simply. "I know. So am I." In her room, Marianne undressed and washed with water from the basin, her muscles aching from the unaccustomed physical labor. She climbed into bed and lay listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the farmhouse settling, of James moving around downstairs before climbing to his own room across the hall. One day down, a lifetime to go. But maybe, just maybe, it wouldn't be as unbearable as she'd feared. Maybe it might even become something worth living. 3 weeks passed in a blur of learning and adaptation. Marianne's hands, once soft from indoor work, developed calluses from handling tools and equipment. Her arms grew stronger from hauling water and feed. Her internal clock adjusted to the rhythm of farm life, up before dawn, working through the heat of midday. Collapsing into exhausted sleep soon after sunset, she'd mastered the chickens and could now collect eggs without getting pecked more than occasionally. The cows still intimidated her, but James had begun teaching her the basics of milking, his patient instruction breaking down the process into manageable steps. She'd taken over most of the cooking and had reorganized the kitchen to a system that made more sense to her. Finding satisfaction in creating order from James's bachelor chaos, they'd developed routines that worked for both of them. James handled the heavy fieldwork and livestock management, while Marianne managed the household. The garden, which she was slowly nursing back to health using techniques her mother had taught her, and the detailed record-keeping that James had admitted he'd been neglecting. They ate meals together, worked within sight of each other when possible, and spent evenings on the porch discussing the day's challenges and the next day's plans. It wasn't a traditional marriage by any measure. They still occupied separate bedrooms. Physical contact remained minimal, an occasional hand on her elbow to steady her on uneven ground, his fingers brushing hers when passing tools or dishes. But they were building something, a foundation of mutual respect and growing trust that surprised Marianne with its steadiness. The morning of the storm began like any other. Marianne woke to the rooster's call, dressed quickly, and went downstairs to find James already at the stove, preparing coffee. This had become their pattern. Whoever woke first started the coffee and set out breakfast ingredients for the other. "Morning," James greeted her, his hair still damp from washing at the pump outside. "I need to ride to the Henderson place this morning. Frank sent word yesterday that he has some equipment he's willing to trade. I should be back by early afternoon." "What kind of equipment?" Marianne asked, moving to slice bread for toasting. "A seed drill that's more efficient than what I have. He's upgrading to a newer model and offered me his old one for a fair price. It'll save significant time during planting season." James poured coffee for both of them. "Will you be all right here alone for a few hours?" "I've been alone before," Marianne pointed out. "I managed to survive 19 years before you came along." James smiled at her dry tone. "Fair point. Still, if you need anything, Mrs. Henderson is 3 miles south. And there's the rifle above the door, if any predators cause trouble with the chickens." "I'm not shooting anything," Marianne said firmly. "But I appreciate the information." After breakfast, James saddled his horse and departed south toward the Henderson farm. Marianne watched him ride away, then turned her attention to the day's work. She fed the chickens, collected eggs, checked the garden where her careful watering had actually produced results. Several tomato plants now bore small green fruit, and the beans were climbing their supports with renewed vigor. The morning was unusually humid, the air thick and heavy, in a way that felt different from the typical dry heat. Marianne noticed clouds building on the western horizon, massive formations that rose like mountains in the sky. She'd lived in Oklahoma long enough to recognize the signs of potential severe weather, but the drought had been so persistent that actual rain seemed like a fantasy. By mid-morning, the clouds had spread across half the sky, their undersides dark and ominous. The cattle in the pasture were restless, and the chickens had stopped their usual scratching and pecking, instead clustering near the coop entrance as if seeking shelter before the storm arrived. Marianne went through the house, closing windows, securing anything on the porch that might blow away, preparing for rain that might or might not actually fall. She'd learned not to get her hopes up. Thunderstorms in a drought often produced dramatic displays, but little actual precipitation, the rain evaporating before it reached the parched ground. But this storm felt different. The air pressure was dropping, making her ears pop. The wind had picked up, carrying the distant smell of rain, actual rain, not just dust and heated air. And the clouds continued building, towering structures that blocked the sun and cast the landscape into premature twilight. James had been gone for 3 hours when the first fat raindrops began to fall. Marianne stood on the porch watching in wonder as water hit the dusty yard, creating dark spots that spread and merged. Within minutes, the isolated drops became a steady rain, then a downpour, water falling from the sky in quantities she hadn't seen in over 2 years. She laughed out loud, unable to contain her joy. Rain meant the garden would truly thrive. Rain meant the pastures would regenerate. Rain meant relief from the relentless drought that had squeezed every farm in the region, but her joy turned to concern as the rain intensified further, becoming a deluge that reduced visibility to mere feet. Thunder cracked overhead, so loud it shook the house, followed immediately by lightning that turned the world white for a split second. This wasn't just a beneficial rain, this was a dangerous storm, and James was out in it. Marianne retreated inside as the wind picked up, rattling windows and making the house creak alarmingly. She'd experienced Oklahoma storms before, knew their capacity for sudden violence. Tornadoes, flash floods, lightning strikes, all were real dangers when weather systems this powerful moved through. She tried to distract herself with indoor work, organizing the pantry, updating the farm records, anything to keep from imagining James caught in the storm. Thrown from his horse, injured and alone. But as an hour passed with no sign of his return, her anxiety grew. The storm showed no signs of abating. If anything, it was intensifying. Rain hammering the roof like thrown gravel, wind howling around the corners of the house. Marianne moved from window to window, peering out into the grey chaos, searching for any sign of horse and rider. When James finally appeared, he was on foot, leading his horse rather than riding. Both man and animal were soaked through, water streaming from James's hat and clothes. His horse was limping badly, favoring its left front leg. Marianne threw open the door and ran out into the rain, heedless of getting drenched herself. What happened? She called over the sound of the storm. Lightning spooked her, James shouted back, leading the mare toward the barn. She bolted, stepped in a hole. I think she strained something, but it's not broken. She just needs rest. They got the horse into the barn, and James quickly examined the injured leg, running his hands carefully along the bones and tendons. The mare flinched, but didn't pull away, trusting him despite her obvious discomfort. Soft tissue injury, James concluded. She'll heal, but she needs to stay off it for a few days. He looked at Marianne, really seeing her for the first time since his return. You're soaked. Go back to the house. I'll be there in a few minutes after I get her settled. You're soaked too, Marianne pointed out. And you've been out in this for hours. Come inside now. The horse will be fine for a few minutes while you dry off. Something in her tone brooked no argument. James nodded and followed her back through the rain to the house. Inside, Marianne immediately went for towels, thrusting one at James, while using another to dry her own hair and face. Take off those wet clothes, she ordered. You'll catch pneumonia standing around in them. James hesitated, and Marianne realized what she'd said. Heat rushed to her face. I'll go upstairs, she added quickly. Leave your clothes by the stove to dry. There's a robe in the closet near the bathroom that should fit you. She fled upstairs before he could respond, closing herself in her bedroom while she changed into dry clothes. Her heart was pounding, and not just from her dash through the rain. She'd been genuinely frightened when James hadn't returned on time, genuinely relieved when he finally appeared. When had his safety become something she worried about? When she came back downstairs 20 minutes later, James was sitting near the stove in his robe, his wet clothes hanging on a drying rack nearby. His hair, freed from the hat he always wore outside, was dark and curling slightly as it dried. He looked younger without his usual work attire, less weathered. Thank you, he said quietly. For caring whether I made it back safely? Of course I cared, Marianne replied, busying herself with making tea. If something happened to you, I'd be alone here with no idea how to run this farm. Pure self-interest. Is that really all it is? James asked. Marianne paused in her tea preparation, her back to him. I don't know what else it would be. It could be that after 3 weeks of living together, working together, figuring out how to be partners, you've started to care about me as a person rather than just as a provider of security. She turned to face him, the teapot gripped in her hands. "And if I have? What would that mean?" James met her gaze steadily. "It would mean this marriage is becoming real. Not just a legal arrangement, but an actual partnership where we matter to each other." The admission hung between them, weighted with implication. Marianne set down the teapot carefully, giving herself time to think. 3 weeks ago, she'd married this man out of desperate necessity, had promised herself she would honor the arrangement, but never truly open her heart to him. 3 weeks of his steady presence, his patient teaching, his consistent respect for her boundaries, had eroded that resolve more than she'd realized. "I was worried about you," she admitted quietly. "When you didn't come back and the storm kept getting worse, I was genuinely frightened that something had happened. So yes, I suppose I've started to care. Against my better judgment, against my intention to keep emotional distance, I've started to care." "Why against your better judgment?" James asked. "Because caring makes you vulnerable," Marianne said. "Because if I care about you and this doesn't work, if you turn out to be different than you've presented yourself, or if I can't adapt to this life, or if 1,000 other things go wrong, then it will hurt. And I've had enough hurt in my life already." James stood and crossed to where she stood by the counter. He didn't touch her, but his presence was warm and solid and oddly comforting. "I can't promise nothing will go wrong," he said quietly. "Farms fail. People get sick or injured. Circumstances change. But I can promise that I'll keep being the person I've been these past 3 weeks. The person who respects you, who values your contributions, who sees you as an equal partner rather than a subordinate possession." "How do I know you're not just playing a long game?" Marianne challenged. "Being kind and respectful now, so I'll let my guard down, then showing your true nature once I'm too invested to protect myself." "You don't know," James admitted. "You can't know with certainty. That's the risk of trust. It requires you to believe in someone's character without guarantee. All I can offer is continued evidence through my actions. Time will either prove me trustworthy or expose me as a liar." The honesty of his answer was somehow more reassuring than any passionate declaration could have been. Marianne studied his face, searching for signs of deception or hidden agenda, but found only the same straightforward sincerity she'd seen since their first real conversation at the schoolhouse. "I'm not ready," she said finally, "for this to become a complete marriage. I'm not ready for that level of vulnerability and intimacy." "I know," James replied, "and I'm not asking for it. I'm just acknowledging that we're building something real here, something beyond the arrangement we started with. Whether it ever becomes a traditional marriage or remains a partnership of mutual support and respect, either outcome is acceptable if it's what you genuinely want." Thunder cracked overhead, reminding them both that the storm was still raging outside. James glanced toward the window where rain continued sheeting down. "This rain could change everything," he said, shifting to the safer topic of farming. "If it soaks in properly, if it's not just runoff, the land could recover significantly. The garden will explode with growth. The pastures will regenerate. We might actually have a good harvest this year." "That would make life easier," Marianne agreed, grateful for the change in subject, even as part of her wanted to continue the more personal conversation. They spent the rest of the day inside while the storm raged, doing indoor work, James mending equipment while Marianne worked on sewing projects she'd been neglecting. They spoke little, but the silence was comfortable rather than awkward, two people sharing space without the need to fill every moment with words. By evening, the rain had finally slowed to a gentle drizzle. James ventured out to check on the animals and returned with news that everything had weathered the storm well. The creek was running higher than he'd seen it in years, and the irrigation channels were full to overflowing. "We'll need to check the fields tomorrow," he said over the simple supper Marianne had prepared. "Make sure the rain didn't cause erosion or wash out any crops. But overall, this is the best thing that could have happened. First significant rain in nearly 3 years." That night, as Marianne prepared for bed, she found herself thinking about the conversation they'd had during the storm, about caring and vulnerability, and the marriage that was slowly becoming real despite her resistance. She looked at her reflection in the small mirror above her. Washstand, the face that was becoming tanned from outdoor work, the hair that she now wore in a practical braid rather than the elaborate styles she'd favored in town, the hands that bore witness to physical labor. She was changing, becoming someone different from the schoolteacher who'd stood at that altar 3 weeks ago. Was she becoming someone who could fully embrace this life, this partnership, this unexpected marriage? She didn't know yet, but for the first time, she was willing to consider the possibility that the answer might eventually be yes. Downstairs, she heard James banking the fire for the night, the familiar sounds of him preparing the house for sleep. Tomorrow, they would assess storm damage together. They would work side by side, as they had every day for 3 weeks. They would continue building this partnership, this marriage, this life, and Marianne found herself looking forward to it instead of dreading it. That realization, more than anything else, showed her how much had already changed. The storm had brought rain to parched land, but it had also washed away some of the barriers she'd constructed around her heart, leaving her vulnerable to possibilities she'd never expected to consider. Whether that was dangerous or hopeful, only time would tell. The rain transformed the landscape within days. What had been brown and brittle became touched with green, as dormant seeds responded to the moisture they'd been waiting years to receive. The garden exploded with growth. Tomatoes swelled on their vines, beans climbed toward the sky, and even the struggling herbs Marianne had planted began to flourish. The pastures showed the most dramatic change, native grasses pushing up through soil that had seemed dead, creating grazing land that brought James's cattle down from the hills where they'd been seeking sparse vegetation. Marianne stood in the garden on a Tuesday morning, 5 weeks after her wedding, surveying the transformation with satisfaction. This was her doing, not just the planting, but the careful watering during the drought, the composting system she'd implemented, the companion planting techniques her mother had taught her. The garden's success was tangible proof that she was contributing real value to the farm, not just occupying space and consuming resources. She was picking ripe tomatoes, her basket already half full, when she heard the sound of a wagon approaching. Visitors were rare enough that any arrival was noteworthy. Marianne set down her basket and wiped her hands on her apron, shading her eyes to see who was coming. The wagon that crested the rise and rolled toward the house was familiar, Thomas Garrett's delivery wagon from his general store. But it wasn't Garrett driving. Instead, a woman Marianne recognized sat on the bench, handling the reins with confident ease. Judith Garrett, Thomas's daughter, was 23 and had a reputation in Millbrook as a woman with sharp opinions and little patience for social niceties. She'd never married despite several proposals, preferring to work in her father's store and manage the business side of his various enterprises. Marianne had encountered her occasionally when shopping in town, had always found her intelligent if somewhat intimidating. What was she doing here? James emerged from the barn, clearly having heard the wagon as well. He walked to meet Judith as she brought the wagon to a stop near the house, his expression neutral but alert. "Miss Garrett," he greeted her politely. "Unexpected to see you this far from town, Mr. Crawford." Judith nodded at him, then turned her attention to Marianne. "Mrs. Crawford, I hope I'm not intruding, but I have some business to discuss with you both." "Business?" James's tone suggested he found this unlikely, but wasn't dismissing the possibility. "May we speak inside?" Judith asked, glancing around as if concerned about being overheard, despite the obvious absence of anyone else for miles. James looked to Marianne, who nodded. They moved into the house, and Marianne quickly cleared the table of her morning's correspondence, letters she'd been writing to her mother and brother, updating them on life at the farm. Judith settled into one of the chairs, with the air of someone accustomed to conducting business in uncomfortable circumstances. She was dressed practically in a simple day dress, rather than the elaborate fashions some town women favored. Her dark hair pulled back in a no-nonsense bun. "I'll be direct," Judith said once they were all seated. "My father's business dealings have not escaped my notice, particularly the arrangement that led to your marriage." Marianne felt her spine stiffen. Was this woman here to judge them? To spread gossip about the circumstances of their wedding? "That arrangement is concluded," James said carefully. "The debt was paid. What interest could your father possibly have in our marriage now?" "My father has no interest," Judith replied. "But I do. You see, I've spent the past month reviewing his financial records, and I've discovered some troubling patterns." She pulled a small ledger from her bag and opened it on the table. "My father runs a poker game, as you know. He also extends credit to players who can't cover their losses immediately. The interest rates he charges are substantial, legally defensible barely, but ethically questionable." "We're aware of how your father conducts business," Marianne said, unable to keep the edge from her voice. "He held my father's debt and would have destroyed my family if James hadn't intervened." "Precisely," Judith said, meeting Marianne's eyes directly. "Your father wasn't the first man my father has driven to desperation. And the pattern I've noticed is disturbing. In the past 3 years, there have been 5 instances where fathers have traded daughters to settle gambling debts, sometimes to my father's associates, sometimes to men like Mr. Crawford, who needed wives and had resources to pay." The room fell silent. Marianne felt sick. She'd known her situation was unjust, but learning it was part of a systematic pattern was somehow worse. "Why are you telling us this?" James asked, his voice dangerously quiet. "Because I want it to stop," Judith said flatly. "I've confronted my father about it. He claims he's simply facilitating mutually beneficial arrangements that the women involved gain security they wouldn't otherwise have. But I've spoken to 2 of those women, and their situations are not good. Husbands who view them as purchased property. Abuse, both verbal and physical. One woman has tried to leave twice and been forcibly returned." Marianne's hand found James's on the table, gripping it tightly. He didn't pull away, instead squeezing her fingers in return. "What exactly do you want from us?" James asked. Judith leaned forward. "I want testimony. I'm building a case to present to the territorial authorities about my father's predatory lending practices. If I can demonstrate that he's systematically exploiting desperate men and essentially trafficking their daughters, I can get his business practices investigated and hopefully stopped." "You want us to testify against your own father?" Marianne asked incredulously. "I want to prevent other young women from being sold into marriages they don't want," Judith corrected. "If that requires exposing my father's unethical behavior, then yes. He raised me to value justice over family loyalty. He shouldn't be surprised when I apply that lesson to his own actions." James was quiet for a long moment, clearly thinking through the implications. "What kind of testimony would you need?" "Details about how the debt was incurred, the circumstances of the arrangement, whether there was any coercion or threat involved," Judith explained. "I already have documentation of the financial transactions from my father's records. What I need is personal testimony about how these arrangements actually work, how they affect the people involved." "And if we refuse?" Marianne asked. "Then I continue building my case with the information I can gather elsewhere," Judith said. "But your situation is unique because, from what I've observed, you've both made the best of difficult circumstances. That contrast would be powerful, showing that while your arrangement has worked out relatively well, it's the exception rather than the rule. Most women in similar situations are suffering." Marianne looked at James, trying to gauge his reaction. His face was unreadable, but she could feel tension in the hand that still held hers. "Can we discuss this privately?" James asked Judith. "Of course," Judith stood. "I'll wait outside." "Take whatever time you need." After she left, closing the door behind her, Marianne and James sat in silence for a moment. "What do you think?" James asked finally. "I think she's right that my father's arrangement with Garrett was exploitative," Marianne said slowly. And if other women are suffering in situations like mine or worse, then something should be done about it. But, James prompted, clearly hearing the hesitation in her voice, but testifying means exposing our private circumstances publicly. It means the whole territory knowing exactly how our marriage came about. It means judgment and gossip and people looking at us differently. We'd face that regardless if Judith pursues this case, James pointed out. The details of your father's debt and our arrangement are already documented in Garrett's records. The only question is whether we participate actively or have our story told without our input. He turned to face her directly. I'll support whatever you decide. If you want to testify, I'll testify alongside you. If you want nothing to do with this, we'll send Judith away and accept whatever consequences come from that choice. This is your decision, Marianne. You're the one who was most wronged by the situation. The fact that he was giving her this choice, this agency, meant everything. Marianne thought about the women Judith had mentioned, women who'd been traded like property and now lived in fear or suffering. She thought about her own fear on that wedding day, her certainty that she was being delivered into a nightmare. She'd been lucky. James had been honorable, respectful, genuinely committed to building a partnership. But luck shouldn't be the determining factor in whether a woman escaped abuse. I want to testify, Marianne said firmly. Not just for those other women, but for myself. I want to speak publicly about what happened, about how wrong it was that my father could trade me away to pay his debts. Even if our marriage has turned out better than I feared, the system that created it is unjust and needs to be challenged. James nodded. Then we'll do it together. They called Judith back inside, and Marianne informed her of their decision. Relief was visible on Judith's face. Thank you, she said sincerely. I know this isn't easy, exposing your private circumstances, but your testimony could make a real difference. They spent the next hour discussing details, what information would be needed, when the territorial hearing might occur, what kind of questions they should prepare to answer. Judith proved to be thorough and professional, treating the matter with the seriousness it deserved. There's one more thing, Judith said as she prepared to leave. I should warn you that my father will not take this well. He has influence in Millbrook and connections throughout the county. When he learns that you're testifying against his business practices, he may attempt retaliation. What kind of retaliation? James asked sharply. Economic pressure, primarily. He could try to prevent you from purchasing supplies through his store. He might spread damaging rumors. If he's feeling particularly vindictive, he could attempt to manipulate your father, Mrs. Crawford, into creating more problems for your family. Marianne's stomach dropped. She hadn't considered that her testimony might put her parents and brother at risk. My father has no more leverage over the Fletcher family, James said firmly. I burned all the debt documentation. There's nothing Garrett can use against them. He doesn't need documentation to cause trouble, Judith pointed out. He can refuse to extend credit at his store, which would make purchasing necessities difficult for a family with limited resources. He can spread rumors that damage your father's reputation, making it harder for him to find work. Then we'll help them, Marianne decided. We'll make sure my family has what they need. But I won't be silenced by threats of what Garrett might do. Judith smiled approvingly. You're braver than most people give you credit for, Mrs. Crawford. Millbrook saw you as the schoolteacher who got sold to settle her father's debts. They didn't see the woman who would stand up and challenge the system that allowed it to happen. After Judith departed, promising to keep them informed about the hearing schedule, Marianne and James stood on the porch watching the wagon disappear toward town. Are you certain about this? James asked. Once we testify, there's no taking it back. We'll be making powerful enemies, I'm certain, Marianne said. For the first time since this whole situation began, I feel like I have some agency, some power to affect change instead of just being swept along by circumstances. That's worth the risk. James put his arm around her shoulders, the first time he'd initiated such casual physical contact. Marianne leaned into him slightly, accepting the comfort and solidarity the gesture offered. Then we'll face whatever comes together, he said simply. That evening, Marianne wrote a long letter to her mother, explaining what had happened and what they'd decided to do. She was honest about the potential consequences, about Garrett's possible retaliation, but she was also clear about why the testimony mattered. "I was lucky," she wrote. "James is a good man who has treated me with respect and dignity. But luck shouldn't determine whether a woman escapes abuse. The system that allowed father to trade me away to pay his gambling debts is wrong, and if I have an opportunity to challenge that system, I have to take it. Please understand that this isn't about punishing father. He's punished himself enough through his own poor choices. This is about preventing other fathers from having the option to repeat his mistakes." She sealed the letter and set it aside for James to mail next time he went to town. Then she climbed the stairs to her bedroom, but paused at the door to James's room. Seeing light under the door indicating he was still awake, she knocked softly, and he called for her to enter. James was sitting at a small desk, writing in what she recognized as one of his farm ledgers. He looked up when she entered, surprise evident in his expression. "Is everything all right?" he asked. "I just wanted to say thank you," Marianne said, "for supporting my decision to testify, for not trying to talk me out of it or minimizing the importance of what Judith is trying to do. You don't need to thank me for treating you like an autonomous person capable of making her own decisions," James replied. "That should be the baseline expectation, not something worthy of gratitude, and yet most men wouldn't see it that way," Marianne pointed out. "Most husbands would have forbidden me from testifying, claiming they were protecting me or protecting the family reputation." James set down his pen and turned to face her fully. "I married you under circumstances that gave you no real choice. The least I can do is ensure you have choices now, about everything from whether to testify to what you want this marriage to become." Marianne crossed to where he sat and, acting on impulse, leaned down to kiss his cheek. It was brief, chaste but deliberate, the first time she'd initiated any physical affection. "Thank you anyway," she said softly, then left before he could respond. Back in her own room, Marianne sat on the edge of her bed, her heart pounding. Something had shifted today. The arrival of Judith Garrett, the decision to testify, the growing recognition that her marriage was becoming something real and valuable. All of it was pushing her toward a choice she'd been avoiding. How long would she keep James at arm's length? How long would she maintain separate bedrooms and emotional distance from a man who had proven himself trustworthy in every way that mattered? She didn't know the answer yet, but she was beginning to suspect that the answer was changing, that her resistance was eroding, not because she was being pressured or manipulated, but because she was genuinely starting to care for the man she'd married. That realization was both terrifying and oddly exhilarating. Outside her window, the Oklahoma night was alive with cricket song. The land was recovering from years of drought, green pushing up through brown, life returning to what had seemed dead. Maybe she was recovering too, Marianne thought. Maybe she was finding her way toward a life she could actually want instead of just endure. Time would tell, but for now she had hope. And that was more than she'd had 5 weeks ago when she'd stood at that altar and promised herself to a stranger. The territorial hearing was scheduled for the 3rd week of September, 2 months after Marianne's wedding. In the weeks leading up to it, life on the farm continued its rhythms: harvest preparations, preservation of the garden's bounty, repairs to equipment before winter arrived. But underneath the daily routine ran a current of tension as they prepared for the testimony that would expose their private circumstances to public scrutiny. Thomas Garrett's retaliation began almost immediately after word spread that James and Marianne would be testifying. The town's attitude toward them shifted perceptibly on James's next trip to purchase supplies. Conversations stopped when he entered buildings. The prices at Garrett's store, which held a near monopoly on goods in Millbrook, suddenly increased for anything James tried to purchase, and rumors began circulating. whispered speculation about what kind of man would publicly humiliate his wife by dragging their marital arrangements into a legal proceeding. "They're saying you forced me to agree to testify," Marianne said one evening after James returned from town with the latest gossip. "That I wanted to keep our circumstances private, but you insisted on making a spectacle." James's jaw tightened. "Of course they are. Garrett can't attack our credibility directly, so he's trying to paint me as controlling and you as a victim. It's clever, actually. Makes people question whether anything you say in testimony is truly your own opinion. Then I need to go to town myself," Marianne decided. "Let people see that I'm making my own choices, that I'm not some cowering wife being bullied into this." The following Saturday, Marianne accompanied James to Millbrook for the first time since their wedding. She dressed carefully in one of her better dresses, styled her hair properly instead of in the practical braid she wore for farm work, and held her head high as they drove the wagon down Millbrook's main street. The attention was immediate and uncomfortable. Women she'd worked with at the schoolhouse whispered behind their hands. Men stared openly, assessing her with gazes that ranged from curious to hostile. But Marianne forced herself to smile and nod greetings, to act as though she had nothing to be ashamed of. Their first stop was the general store, not Garrett's establishment, but a smaller competitor run by a widow named Sarah Mitchell. Mrs. Mitchell greeted them warmly. "If carefully, Mrs. Crawford," she said. "It's good to see you looking well. Farm life seems to suit you." "It does," Marianne replied, pleased that her voice sounded steady. "More than I expected, actually. I came to purchase some fabric. I need to make warmer clothes for winter, and I'm told your selection is excellent." The small talk was deliberate, a statement that she was here by choice, engaged in normal activities, not hidden away on the farm in shame or fear. As Marianne examined fabric options, other customers entered the store, and she made a point of greeting them politely, refusing to be cowed by their curious stares. Mrs. Henderson arrived while Marianne was still shopping, and the older woman's face lit up with genuine pleasure. "Marianne! I was hoping I'd see you. How have you been managing?" "Very well, thank you," Marianne said warmly. "Your bread on my wedding day was the best I've ever tasted. I've been trying to replicate it without success. Come for tea next week and I'll teach you my technique," Mrs. Henderson offered immediately. "Tuesday afternoon, if that suits you?" The invitation was both kind and strategic, a public show of support from a respected member of the community. Marianne accepted gratefully, and she noticed the subtle shift in the store's atmosphere. If Clara Henderson was comfortable associating with the Crawfords, perhaps their situation wasn't as scandalous as gossip suggested. Their next stop was more difficult, visiting Marianne's family. Her mother had written several letters in response to Marianne's explanation of the testimony decision, expressing support mixed with worry about the consequences. Now, seeing her daughter in person for the first time since the wedding, Dorothy Fletcher's eyes filled with tears. "You look healthy," she said, embracing Marianne tightly. "Strong. I was so worried." "I'm fine, Mama," Marianne assured her. "Better than fine, actually. James has been good to me. The farm is prospering. I'm learning things I never imagined I'd need to know." They sat in the Fletchers' small parlor, James included at Marianne's insistence, and discussed the upcoming hearing. Robert Fletcher was notably absent, working in town according to Dorothy, though Marianne suspected he was avoiding the conversation out of shame. "I want you to understand why I'm doing this," Marianne said to her mother. "It's not to punish Father or to embarrass the family. It's to prevent other girls from being put in the same situation." "I understand," Dorothy said quietly, "and I'm proud of you for having the courage to speak up. What your father did, what I allowed him to do, was wrong. If your testimony helps change things, then perhaps some good can come from our mistakes." Samuel, now 15, sat listening intently to the conversation. Finally he spoke up. "Are you happy, Marianne?" "Really happy." The directness of the question caught Marianne off guard. She glanced at James, who was watching her with that steady grey gaze that had become so familiar. "I'm building toward happiness," she said carefully. I'm not where I imagined I'd be at 19, but I'm discovering that what I imagined wasn't necessarily what I truly needed. Does that make sense? Samuel nodded slowly. Mr. Crawford treats you well? He does, Marianne confirmed. He treats me as an equal partner, respects my opinions, and gives me autonomy in decisions about our life together. That's more than many women in traditional marriages can say. The conversation continued for another hour before James and Marianne took their leave. As they climbed back into the wagon, Marianne felt exhausted but satisfied. She'd faced the town, demonstrated her agency and well-being, and reconnected with her family. Whatever happened at the hearing, she'd established herself as a person making her own choices rather than a victim to be pitied. The hearing took place in the territorial courthouse in Cheyenne, a 3-day journey from the farm. James and Marianne made the trip with Judith Garrett, who had arranged for them to stay with friends of hers who supported the case she was building. The courthouse was imposing, a stone building that spoke of law and authority and consequences. Marianne's stomach churned with anxiety as they entered, but James's hand found hers, squeezing gently in support. The hearing room was already crowded. Thomas Garrett sat with his lawyers, his face a mask of controlled anger. Several other men, whose predatory lending practices were under investigation, occupied nearby seats. And scattered throughout the room were faces Marianne recognized, women from Millbrook and surrounding areas, some of whom she suspected might be other victims of similar arrangements. The territorial judge, a stern-looking woman named Eleanor Morrison, called the hearing to order. Judge Morrison had a reputation for fairness, but also for no-nonsense efficiency. She would not tolerate emotional appeals or theatrics. She wanted facts, evidence, and clear testimony. Judith Garrett was called first. She presented her documentation methodically, ledgers showing the pattern of loans, interest rates that bordered on usury, and the specific instances where daughters had been traded to settle debts. Her testimony was clinical, factual, devastating in its implications. Then came testimony from 2 other women who'd been in situations similar to Marianne's. The first, a young woman named Elizabeth Porter, described her marriage to a man 30 years her senior who viewed her as purchased property. She spoke in a monotone about verbal abuse, isolation, and her husband's insistence that because he'd paid good money for her, she owed him absolute obedience. The second woman, Martha Jennings, was even worse off. She described physical abuse, her husband's drinking, multiple attempts to leave that had been thwarted by both her husband and her father, who insisted she honor the arrangement he'd made. Her testimony was interrupted several times as she broke down crying, unable to continue. By the time Marianne was called to testify, the mood in the courtroom was grim. Judge Morrison's expression suggested she'd heard enough to form strong opinions about the practices under investigation. Mrs. Crawford, Judge Morrison began, please describe for the record how you came to be married to James Crawford. Marianne took a breath and began her testimony. She explained her father's gambling addiction, the debt to Thomas Garrett, the morning she learned she was being traded away to settle that debt. She described her desperation, her lack of real choice, the fear that had consumed her on her wedding day, but then she shifted her narrative. However, I need to state clearly that my experience after marriage has been different from the other women who've testified. My husband has treated me with consistent respect and dignity. He has given me autonomy in household decisions, has taught me farm skills patiently without belittling my inexperience, and has never pressured me for intimacy I wasn't ready to offer. She saw Thomas Garrett lean forward, clearly hoping she was about to undermine Judith's case. But Marianne continued, that said, the fact that I was fortunate in my husband's character doesn't make the system that put me in this position any less wrong. I had no way of knowing James would be honorable. I could just as easily have ended up like Mrs. Porter or Mrs. Jennings, trapped in an abusive marriage with no escape. The fact that I got lucky doesn't justify a practice that allows fathers to trade their daughters like property to settle gambling debts. Judge Morrison nodded approvingly. "Please continue, Mrs. Crawford." Marianne described the power dynamics, the way Thomas Garrett had facilitated the arrangement while profiting from her father's addiction, the systematic nature of the exploitation Judith had documented. She spoke clearly, confidently, her teaching experience serving her well as she organized her thoughts and presented them coherently. When Garrett's lawyer cross-examined her, trying to suggest she was exaggerating or misrepresenting the situation, Marianne held her ground. Yes, she was currently satisfied with her marriage. No, her husband hadn't abused or mistreated her. But that didn't change the fundamental injustice of how the marriage had come about, or the need to prevent similar arrangements from trapping other women with less honorable men. James was called next, and his testimony was similarly balanced. He acknowledged his role in the arrangement, didn't try to paint himself as a savior, but clearly articulated why the system that had benefited him was nonetheless ethically indefensible. "I was lonely and wanted a wife," James said plainly. "When I learned about Robert Fletcher's debt situation, I saw an opportunity. But the opportunity existed because Thomas Garrett had deliberately created a crisis that made desperate men willing to trade their daughters. That's exploitation, regardless of how any individual marriage turns out afterward. The hearing lasted 2 full days. By the end, Judge Morrison had heard testimony from multiple victims, reviewed extensive financial documentation, and listened to attempts by Garrett and the other men to justify their practices as traditional matchmaking and mutually beneficial arrangements. Judge Morrison's ruling was swift and uncompromising. She issued orders restricting the interest rates that could be charged on personal loans, required detailed documentation of any transaction involving family members as collateral, and specifically prohibited arrangements where daughters were traded to settle debts. Violations would result in criminal charges including fraud and human trafficking. Furthermore, she ordered Thomas Garrett to pay restitution to several of the women who testified, and she referred his case to territorial prosecutors for potential criminal charges related to usury and exploitation. As they left the courthouse, Judith caught up with them, her face showing exhausted triumph. "You did it. Your testimony was exactly what we needed. The contrast between your relatively positive outcome and the other women's suffering made it impossible for the judge to dismiss this as just traditional matchmaking." "What happens now?" Marianne asked. "Now the ruling gets enforced," Judith said. "My father's business practices will be restricted. Other women in similar situations will have legal recourse, and hopefully fathers will think twice before trying to trade their daughters to settle debts." Back at the farm 3 days later, Marianne and James fell back into their routines. But something had fundamentally shifted. The public testimony, the shared experience of facing down social pressure and potential retaliation, had forged a deeper bond between them. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Marianne made a decision. She reached for James's hand, intertwining her fingers with his. "I've been thinking," she said quietly, "about this marriage, about what it is and what it could be." James turned to look at her, his expression carefully neutral, clearly not wanting to pressure her in any direction. "And what have you concluded?" "That I don't want separate bedrooms anymore," Marianne said, her heart pounding. "That I'm tired of maintaining distance from someone I've come to care for deeply. That I want this to be a real marriage in every sense, if you're still willing." James was quiet for a long moment, and Marianne felt panic rising. Had she misread his feelings? Was he no longer interested now that she was finally ready? Then he squeezed her hand gently. "I'm willing. I've been willing since the day I proposed this arrangement. But Marianne, I need you to be absolutely certain. I need to know this is what you genuinely want, not what you think you should want or what you feel obligated to offer." "I'm certain," Marianne said firmly. "I'm not saying I'm not still scared or that I have all the answers. But I know I want to build a complete life with you, not just a partnership of convenience. You've proven yourself trustworthy in every way that matters. I'm ready to trust you with this too." James lifted her hand to his lips, kissing her knuckles gently. Then yes, absolutely yes. That night, Marianne moved her belongings into James's room, their room now. The physical intimacy that followed was gentle, patient. Everything she'd hoped it would be, with a man who truly cared for her comfort and consent. Afterward, lying in James's arms in the darkness, Marianne felt a peace she hadn't experienced since before her father's debts had destroyed her plans for the future. "I never thought I'd say this," she whispered, "but I'm glad things turned out this way. Not glad about the circumstances that brought us together, but glad that I ended up here, with you, building this life." "So am I," James replied, his breath warm against her hair. "So am I." The next morning, Marianne woke to find James already up, bringing her coffee in bed, a small gesture that spoke of consideration and care. They spent the day working together as they always had, but with a new dimension of intimacy underlying their partnership. Word eventually reached them that Thomas Garrett had been convicted of fraud and usury. Sentenced to 3 years in territorial prison, his business was being liquidated to pay restitution to his victims, and territorial law had been amended to include specific protections against the kind of arrangements that had brought Marianne and James together. Marianne's father wrote a letter of apology. Belated, inadequate but sincere. He'd found steady work and was beginning to pay back some of the money Samuel needed for his education. Dorothy's letters were full of relief that her daughter was truly happy and news of Samuel's academic progress. On a crisp October evening, as they harvested the last of the garden before first frost, James paused in his work and looked at Marianne. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked. "That morning you agreed to marry me?" Marianne considered the question carefully. "I regret the circumstances. I regret that my father's weakness put me in that position. I regret that other women suffered far worse outcomes. But regret marrying you specifically? No, I don't regret that." She set down the basket of squash she'd been carrying and crossed to where James stood. "You gave me a choice when you didn't have to. You respected me when you could have demanded obedience. You built a partnership when you could have established dominance. That's worth more than any romantic courtship could have been." James pulled her close, and they stood together in the fading light, surrounded by the evidence of their shared labor. The thriving garden, the repaired barn, the well-maintained house. Two people who'd been strangers 3 months ago, now bound by genuine affection and mutual respect. "Thank you," James said quietly, "for taking a chance on me, for building this with me, for becoming my partner in more than just name." "Thank you for being worth the chance," Marianne replied. As winter approached, they prepared the farm together, worked side by side through long days, and discovered that the marriage of convenience they'd entered had transformed into something neither of them had expected, a genuine partnership built on respect, trust, and growing love. The town eventually stopped gossiping. Life continued, and Marianne discovered that sometimes the worst beginning could lead to the best outcome. If both people were willing to build something real from impossible circumstances. She'd been given away at 19 to a poor farmer she didn't know what he'd done on their wedding night. Treated her with respect, given her autonomy, proven himself trustworthy, had shocked everyone. But what they'd built together in the months that followed had shocked them both, in the best possible way. And that, Marianne thought as she fell asleep in her husband's arms, was the real story worth telling. Not the desperate beginning, but the hopeful middle and the promising future they were creating together, one day at a time. Up next, you got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.